Welcome back to the program. We are joined again by Colonel Jacques Baud, a former member of the Swiss intelligence services, an expert on the Middle East, and also quite a prolific author. So I'm very glad to have you back because there's a lot to discuss on what is actually happening in the Middle East.
Problem. Thank you very much for having me in your show. Thank you.
Well, we now have the media filled up with celebration of this peace agreement to end the 2 year long slaughter in Gaza, and this is good news for ending, of course, all the killing and allowing some normalcy to establish itself. However, I'm curious how durable you think this peace is, because I guess what is quite unique about this peace plan is that the next steps haven't really been clearly fleshed out, which, well, it makes it reasonable to suspect that they will stumble across problems kind of going forward. And I'm guessing once things go bad, the main focus will be on narrative control, blaming the right side for things going wrong. But I guess the most important thing is the Palestinian state. It seems like there has to be the foundation of a durable peace, yet it doesn't really look like this is a clear commitment. I mean, it does appear in as one of the points in the plan, but when you listen to the speeches from the Israelis and the Americans, one doesn't really get the impression that they have any intention of honoring this.
Yes, I think everybody asks the same question, whether this agreement is will be lasting long or not. Um, First of all, as you rightly said, we have a several phase. I mean, the concept is basically to have different phase, and only the first one has been defined. We are more or less back to the situation we had in January this year, with the agreement that had been crafted already in early 2024, and which has been kept in on shelf for months before being resurrected somehow by the Trump administration in January. And this plan, which in essence is the basis for the current agreement, was also based on a three-phase approach, with a first phase, which is basically a ceasefire with exchange of prisoners and all that. A second phase, which deals with more durable solution, reconstruction, reestablishment of humanitarian services, and things like this. And a third phase that would lead, in fact, to a durable situation with Palestinian institutions and all that. Problem is, as it is today, that the second and third phase have never been really defined and negotiated. It was only on a drawing board, but not really defined, and in fact, never discussed in depth. And we are in the same situation today. And the problem being that Israel, and I think that's something that is across the board. It's not just Benjamin Netanyahu. It is something which is, I think, widely understood in the Israeli population, that it should not be a Palestinian state, period. And therefore, I understand the position of the Palestinians, and more specifically of the Hamas, in the current situation. Because what happened, that this plan, the current plan, had been discussed as a 21-point plan by Donald Trump and Arab states in September, and then was discussed with Benjamin Netanyahu, where it became a 20-point plan. The interesting aspect is when I compare the two documents, at least the version that I have, the point that has been removed is the promise of Israel not to strike Qatar again. And that's the point that was removed from the 20-point plan to the 20-point plan. So this is a very interesting. Although you can interpret that in different manner, but there is also, let's say the fairest interpretation is that it was a plan about Palestine, not a plan about Qatar. And therefore, you can explain that. But in any case, that's the point that disappeared. The rest is a reformulation of the 20 other points. And but the interesting point, the interest aspect of this is that it was not discussed with the Palestinians themselves. It is something discussed with Arab states, then with Israel, and then given to the Palestinian with the idea, with the more or less the idea, take it or leave it. And that's what, in fact, Hamas and Palestinians had only 2 or 3 days, 3 or 4 days to have a position on that. So the Hamas accepted, although if you read the document, it's not really in favor of the Palestinians. And the problem for the Hamas was the following. By not agreeing to this agreement, it would then justify the continuation of the war by Israel, and therefore be in a political and strategic bad position. By accepting the agreement, even if it's not in favor of Palestinian, at least it didn't improve its tactical situation, but it improved, or it let's say strengthened its political and strategic position as the party that accepted a deal, not as the party who didn't accept a deal. And that's, if you read the discussions that happened within Hamas, this is exactly that was the center of the discussion. And they issued a statement that has not been widely published in the West, but it was published by Donald Trump, by the way, a statement confirming that they agree with this accord, but with some reservations on some aspects that need to be further negotiated. So it's a very clever answer to the this diktat of Donald Trump, in fact, because they didn't say no. They say we accept, but this needs to be adjusted. I mean, the issue of disarming the resistance, for instance, and things like this. And on those aspects that needs to be negotiated, we have also to understand that the position of the Palestinian resistance is very strong. When we talk about disarming, for instance, the Hamas and the Palestinian resistance, we have to remember that we have Resolution 45-130 of December 1990 that legitimizes Palestinian resistance, including with armored force. And this is based on the right of the population for self-determination, and on the fact that the Palestinian territory, because according to the International Court of Justice, it is not territories, but territory. It's one Palestinian territory, even if it comprises Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank. The Palestinian territory is occupied, is occupied militarily, illegally by Israel, and therefore resistance is legitimate, but not only resistance, but only resistance including armored force. Meaning that for instance, you have France. They are ready to recognize Palestine, but under the condition that Palestinian resistance should be disarmed. This is against the UN resolution. And many countries have said the same, in fact. I think Belgium has very similar position. I mean, the Belgians have always a similar position to the French, by the way. But this is another discussion. In any case, we are in this situation where we are the Palestinians want these rights, the right to defend themselves, the right to resist should be acknowledged and should be part or taken into account, if you want, in the agreement. Therefore, they have a very strong position when they say, we agree, but it needs to be negotiated. Now, why did they agree? Because they knew that regardless of their decision, Israel would not respect the agreement. And I think there is no doubt in the mind of the Palestinians, as in the mind of many people, including myself, in the West, that Israel will not abide by the agreement at the end. It will find a way to resume fighting. This has always been the case since we can even say 1947. The Israelis have never bidden by a treaty or a UN resolution. Therefore, I mean, if it was not in their interest. So the thing is that the Palestinians know that the Israelis will not. Therefore, they have to be in a better political position. Because even if the war resumes, at least they are in the position of those who accepted the deal. And the Israelis would be those who rejected the deal de facto. So it is a very strategic position of the Palestinians. This is very consistent with the Palestinian approach to the conflict since the very beginning, because the whole idea of the Palestinians is not just to kill Israelis, and the fact show that they don't kill much Israelis. This is a fact. The whole idea is to raise the importance of the Palestinian question on the international stage. And that was one of the reasons for the 7th of October 2023, because the situation was boiling in the Gaza Strip and in other places. We have to remember that in early 2023, we had not only problems in the Gaza Strip, including the fact that Qatar stopped to pay the civil servants in the Gaza Strip, leaving a lot of people without any salary, basically. And that created a social problem in the Gaza Strip in the spring of 2023. Then you had the issues of the Mount of the Temple in Jerusalem. You remember that the Jewish, I mean, radical Jews have this plan to rebuild the third Temple of Solomon, and that would include the destruction, or partial destruction at least, of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And that's the reason why, by the way, the operation launched by the Hamas, I have the book that I wrote that came just a couple of months after the operation, but that was Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, for a good reason, because it was not about Gaza, it was also about the situation in Al-Aqsa. And because the pressure was mounting before October, in fact, I started to write the book before October 7. And it was published just a couple of months later, but it's a huge, in this book, I've come back to the whole history of the Israeli-Palestinian relationship with a lot of, I mean, it's more on the issues of how the Israeli mismanaged the the issue of the Palestinian resistance. There are a lot of data in that, a lot of research, and to do that, I needed a lot of time. But the reason why the book came so short after the 7th of October is that because the tension was so high that I started to write the book before. And that's a lot of people have forgotten that because everybody wants the crisis. The crisis started on the 7th of October, but it's not true. And you had also the problem in the West Bank during the whole 2023. And that's for that reason, by the way, that's also what allowed the different Palestinian faction, because it's not just the Hamas, there's about 12 different factions that attacked on the 7th of October. And the reason why they could do it is because a lot of soldiers that were devoted normally to the security or the surveillance or monitoring of the Gaza Strip were in fact sent to the West Bank because tension was mounting there. So the 7th of October was in fact a way to show to the world that the Palestinian question was reaching a point where everything was ready to explode. And that was a strategic objective, in fact. And this objective has been definitely reached. There are other objectives that, for instance, with the whole question of the prisoners that were subject to discussions until end of 2022, and the government of Israel stopped the negotiations end of 2022. And for that reason also, that prompted the not only the Hamas, but also the other factions to take prisoners in this the so-called Gaza division. That's the division which is responsible for the surveillance and monitoring of the Gaza Strip, in the so-called militarized zone, which is called the Gaza envelope. And in that militarized zone, the idea was to take those prisoners, and those prisoners have been exchanged. I mean, we have seen the last 20 who have been exchanged against Palestinian prisoners. So this objective of having Israel releasing prisoners has always, to some extent, been achieved. So if we look with some distance, the whole the conflict since it's evolved, of course, you have all the destruction, this genocide that has been now defined as a genocide by the UN. Which had been previously defined as a plausible genocide, but now we know the Human Rights Commission, commission of the UN has declared it's a genocide. So we know that, and but all that has there was a price to pay for that. But the strategic objective of the Hamas has certainly been reached through through the whole process, including the agreement. So if we make the bottom line is that the Hamas is certainly not in a completely favorable position. The whole question today is what will the Americans, especially because they are more or less the main, let's say, a coordinator of what's happening, because we cannot expect a negotiation process to be initiated by the Israelis. And the Europeans, you can forget them because they are irrelevant. Even if Macron tries to be in Sharm el Sheikh, he was just mocked by Donald Trump, by the way, because Europeans are inexistent in this conflict. They just feed weapons to Israel, that's all. But for the resolution of the conflict, they play absolutely no role. The US, here we have to admit that Trump has played a role. Now, the problem is that the job is not finished. And what we have seen in Sharm el Sheikh, for me, was kind of a show, but was not a good sign for the what will happen next, because The main actors were not present, so it's a so-called peace summit, but with none of the actors that are in fact directly involved in the conflict, including the Palestinians, including the Hamas. Regardless of what we think about the Hamas, regardless of how we qualify the Hamas, and it's always dangerous to use words such as terrorists and things like this, because then you cut uh, options. So it's a very bad idea, especially that the UN has never defined the Hamas as a terrorist organization. And that's a very important thing. So we see today with Syria that the use of the word terrorist has brought the international community into some kind of dead end, because you don't really know how you deal with people who used to be terrorists but are no longer terrorists. So it's a stupid thing. In any case, whatever we think about the Hamas, it is an actor of the conflict. And if peace cannot be made if you don't talk to the actors of the conflict. That's a basic rule. I mean, you can only make peace with your enemy. You cannot make peace with somebody else.
Yes.
And your enemy must be part of the loop. And that's a very strange situation that we tend to make as if the Palestinians don't exist, and we talk about peace without them. This is absolutely insane from a simple common sense, but also geopolitical sense. You make the peace with your enemy. That's very true in the private life as it is in geopolitics. So you need to include them in and to put them in the loop. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No. I was just gonna say I agree, but this is I always feel this is a wider problem we now have within the West. That is
Absolutely.
the efforts to criminalize our opponents. That is, we do the same with, for example, with the Russians, set up trial against
Exactly.
Putin, saying he's a criminal. It's not just this; it's all adversaries are criminalized at some point, and this is good for developing narratives or managing them to suggest that this is a conflict between the legitimate and the illegitimate, the world policemen and the world criminals, effectively. But as you very correctly point out, the problem in this is you can't do diplomacy anymore, because peace is created not to sit down and talk with your friends, but to sit down and talk with your opponents. And if it's not legitimate to talk to criminals, if they're terrorists or war criminals. Again, as we have discussed before, Kaya Kallas managed actually to utter those words that, why would I talk to Putin? He's a war criminal. This was her whole narrative, but it doesn't make any sense. But
exactly. And even if I look at it from a point of view as a Swiss, for instance, Switzerland used to be a mediator. I mean, your country has done a lot of work also in the area of mediation in the past. But when you mediate with people, and I have been personally involved in some mediation situation, especially in Africa, in local and regional conflicts. In any case, when you mediate, you have to talk to both parties, because basically you stand in the middle and you try to help the communication between the two parties. You need to talk to both of them. Now, the Swiss parliament recently decided that the Hamas is a terrorist organization. So how can you then mediate? You cannot talk to them because they are terrorists, and you define them as terrorists. So even if you would bypass your own laws and your own practices, you would not have the credibility with those people you want to mediate with. So it's a totally absurd situation in which we are. And as you rightly said, we just killed diplomacy with that. And that was the stance of the Americans. All the Europeans, and I include Switzerland in that case, they have adopted this American practice of demonizing the enemy to the point that you cannot talk to them. And that reflects also the kind of wars that the West has waged in the past 30 years. That you wage war without knowing what you want to achieve. Basically, there is no objective, and nobody knows exactly what the Americans achieved in Iraq. Besides toppling Saddam Hussein, what did they achieve? Nothing. They just created chaos, created terrorism. They generated the existence of the Islamic State and all that simply because by creating this instability, they promoted de facto the emergence of radical groups. The same in Syria, the same in Afghanistan, the same in Libya and the whole Sahel region, by the way. And I have been in those regions, and people like really explained to me that these wars didn't reach any tangible result for the West, but completely destabilized reasons. So then you are in a situation where you create a chaos, and since you don't know what you want to achieve, there is no way, there is no need for diplomacy. There is no need for that because you don't know what you want to achieve, and therefore you leave. You fight, you kill, and you leave, and that's it. In Afghanistan, though, the Americans were a little bit wiser because they never considered the Afghan Taliban as terrorists. It's very important to note that they rejected the idea from the very beginning, and they started in October 2001. They came into Afghanistan allegedly because they supported bin Laden and things like that. In any case, they never defined the Afghans, the Taliban Afghans, because you have Talibans in Pakistan. Those were defined as terrorists, but those in Afghanistan were never defined as terrorists. In order to open the door to negotiation, that's a very important point that a lot of people tend to forget. But besides this, in most cases, we were trapped by our own narrative and our own inability to solve the crisis diplomatically. And that's exactly, in fact, the same model we have now for Russia, as you rightly said, or for Palestine. We don't have the diplomacy for them a crisis diplomacy, if you want.
But even in peace, there is limitations if you're not legitimizing the opposition. So before you mentioned the recognition of a, well, conditional recognition of a Palestinian state based on who rules them. So even when you recognize the self-determination, that is the state of the other side, we still do not let them choose their own leaders, which is kind of a key foundation of self-determination. But I did want to move on though and ask about the consequence for Israel, because this war, it has, well, if we want to call it a war, has taken its toll on Israel. Both the domestic politics, its international reputation, its economy, even demographics, as a lot of people have immigrated. What do you see as the most significant internal challenges facing Israel over the next years? Do you see any critical or even existential challenge to Israel if it, I guess, continues down this path?
The problem is probably that because apparently more than 80% of the population supports the policy of Netanyahu towards the Palestinians. All the demonstrations we had in Palestine, which are very often portrayed in the West as a pro-peace or anti-Netanyahu, and things like that, it's not exactly that. Most of the demonstrations were for the return of the so-called hostages, but not against the policy towards the Palestinians, meaning that the the population in Israel is very much politicized, radicalized towards the Palestinians. I see very little incentive within the Israeli society to solve for the long term the situation with Palestine, for instance, having a two-state solution. The Israelis are, as they have always been, for a one-state solution, one state which is a Jewish state, period. It's not a state that allows for other communities to be normal citizens. It's already like this, because even if you have Jews within the current Israel, the Israel as we know it, these don't have the same rights as the Israeli citizens, because one of the fundamental laws, that Israel has no constitution. It has just a sequence, a set of fundamental laws. And in one of the fundamental law that was, by the way, I don't remember exactly the date, but it's very recent. It was defined, it was taken by, adopted under Benjamin Netanyahu, by the way. It was decided that Israel is a Jewish state. So it's not a state. I mean, Norway is not a Protestant or Catholic or whatever state. It is a state, period. As it is in Switzerland, I mean, it's not a religion X state. It is a state. But Israel is a Jewish state. As a result, you have a discrimination within the country with the Palestinians, who were in fact living on the territory before Israel was existed. But so meaning that, and that was since the very beginning. In 1947, as the General Assembly adopted Resolution 181, it's very important to understand, because it's also important to understand the position of the Palestinians. This resolution, which in fact created the basis for the existence of Israel somehow, in fact never gave any single square meter to the Jews. It has never given any square meters. It opened the possibilities to have a two-state or one-state. That was not, let's say, there were plans, and we have seen the map of the proposed plan and all that. But this is just proposition. The idea was the population living in Palestine at that time should decide through referendum what they wanted. And in 19 at that time, the Arabs wanted a one country with two nations. That was the concept. They still have, by the way. That's still the position of the Hamas today. One country with two nations, with equal right for both. That's exactly, if you read the charter of 2017, this is exactly what the Hamas proposes. Despite when we talk about Hamas, we always mention the charter of 1986, which was very, very different. It was very much anti Israel and wanted some kind of exclusivity, and this was. But in the charter of 2017, this is a much softer language, and that's exactly what the Arabs wanted in 1947. And the Israeli at that time wanted two separate states. Because, and of course we can understand that, because it was after World War II, they had suffered discrimination and all that in Europe. Therefore, they wanted their own state. And that's the problem was that if you would have solved this problem through referendum, the Arabs at that time had a 2/3 majority in Palestine. You had roughly 1/3 Jews, 2/3 Arabs. Therefore, a referendum solution would have excluded de facto an Israeli solution. Yes, a Jewish state solution. And for that reason, already in 1947, the Israelis started to gain territory and expelled the Arabs from their own villages and places and location, whatever, in order to take the territory, roughly the territory they had they have today, in fact, more or less, without the occupied territory. And the point where they decided on the 14th of May, 1948, to declare independence. And because then it was considered as a fait accompli by the Arab states, they declared war to Israel, not because they rejected the resolution, as it's very commonly said in the West, but because Israel had in fact gone beyond what was written in the resolution and had created a military fait accompli without considering the UN resolution. And that led to the situation of the war between 1948 and 1949. So, and that's for that reason, in fact, if you look at the problem from a Palestinian perspective, the whole territory of Israel is not legitimate. You see, because this territory should have been defined through referendum, not through violence. And that's the reason why it's very hard for the Palestinians to accept. Even it was, I think, when Sheikh Yassin, who was the founder of the Hamas in 1987, when he said that he would accept the idea of recognizing Israel in its border of June 1967, I mean, the 4th of June 1967, and which is still the position of Hamas today, by the way. They accept to recognize those borders of the current borders of Israel. This is a huge step intellectually, because technically and legally, even what we know from Israel today, is not legal. And it's not even, it's beyond this, because on the 13th of May 1948, even the committee that was managing the independence of Israel, I remind you that the independence came one day after, on the 14th of May. But on the 13th of May, it was a discussion within the committee: how do we define the borders of Israel? In one of those fundamental laws that I mentioned before. And Ben-Gurion, in his memoir, explains that it was decided to not define any border for Israel, because Israel had still in mind, and Ben-Gurion was part of the same faction of the Likud today. And incidentally, I have a leaflet here. It's very interesting because I got recently this leaflet. It's a leaflet of the Irgun, and that was the faction that was leading Israel at that time. And you see the map. If you look carefully to the map, you see that the map of Israel includes the mandatory Palestine, which is not just Israel as we know it today, plus the Palestinian territory, but it also includes what we used to call Transjordan, which is the current Jordan. And that in 1921, the British decided to give to the Hashemite tribe. And this situation, the refusal of the decision of the British decision to give Transjordan, has been prompted by this movement in the Zionist movement, which is called the revisionist Zionism. And a revision, not about, this has nothing to do with Holocaust and things like this, as we tend to call it today. This was revisionist about the decision of the British to cede Transjordan to the Hashemite and to retake that. And for that reason, Israel always contemplated the idea to recover the whole Transjordan and therefore not to define the borders. And that's the reason why even still today, Israel has no official borders. I think it's the only country in the world that has no official borders. And that explains the mindset that you have in Israel today. And Benjamin Netanyahu, by the way, is in fact coming out of this faction of the Zionism. In fact, his faction of the Likud comes from the revisionist Zionism. It's a revisionist, in fact. And for that reason, that explains also the mood in which we have to, the Palestinians will consider the current agreement. Because this idea of the revisionists, the Zionist revisionists, to retake the whole of the former mandatory Palestine, which is considered as a great Israel, is not abandoned. And therefore, what we see today, and that's a reason why when we talk about a peace agreement, coming back to the initial question, I think it's a wrong, we should more properly call it a ceasefire agreement. Because on the view, from the point of view of the Israelis, it is a pause in the conflict, not the end of the conflict. And that's probably the reason why the subsequent phases of the agreement that you mentioned at the very beginning of this program, nobody talks about this, because that will be a no-go from Israel. And that's the reason why, now that the prisoners have been exchanged, and probably Israel will take opportunity to reshuffle its armed forces and all that. But everybody is anxious to see what happens next. Because, again, the idea of peace in Israel is strongly related with this idea that Israel has not reached its final borders.
I do have the borderless Israel is a interesting concept though. But I also wanted to ask you one last question though, which is about Netanyahu now. He has reportedly told President Putin that Israel does not want a war with Iran, and allegedly this message was asked to be passed on to the Iranians. Well, the last time they spoke of peace with Iran and the negotiations, of course, they were bombed. So reasonably, the Iranians are a bit skeptical about the sincerity from Israel, and I guess it's fair that this is just another ploy to make them lower their guard. But how serious, though, do you see the threat of now a direct war between Israel and Iran in the near term?
Well, this conflict with Iran is extremely irrational because, in fact, if you look at it, um, if you look at it from far, we don't really understand what could be the grievance of the Israelis, the real grievance towards Iran, and vice versa. They have no territorial dispute. They are far away from each other. They have distinct area of influence, if you want. So we don't really see why Israel has Iran as its best enemy. In fact, for a very long time, Israel had Iran as an ally in the region, especially because it is the most significant Shiite power in the region, and Israel has always considered that it was surrounded by Sunni countries, and the Shiite ally on the behind this belt, the Sunni belt, was some kind of insurance for Israel in some way. Now that Iran has been get closer to Saudi Arabia, and that the Arab state and the Persian government have reestablished diplomatic and economic relationship, this has changed the equation. Now, this move, even it has been diplomatically very obvious last year with the resumption of the official resumption of diplomatic relations with between Iran and Saudi Arabia. The move has started with the moment in which, after Iraq had been um, defeated by the Americans, because then the Americans started to look towards Iran, and then Iran has become the best enemy of Israel for one good reason, and is that having a conflict with Iran would be for Israel the rationale or a way to force the US to stay in the region. We have a very similar situation to the one we have with Ukraine. All the moves we have around the drone and all this, this let's say agitation in Europe has as an objective to maintain the Americans on the Europe theater, and especially in Ukraine. And here we have exactly the same thing in Israel. Israel wants to keep the Iranian enemy, to maintain the attention and to keep the attention of the US, and to keep the support of the US, because Iran is the enemy of the US, as Russia is essentially an enemy of the US. And therefore, countries, European Union and Ukraine in Europe, and the Israelis are using these conflicts to keep or to maintain the attention of the US and to maintain the support of the US. We have a very similar situation here. But so I doubt that Israel would suddenly change its mind and say, "Well, we don't we make peace with Iran." My feeling is that they have seen in the recent exchange we had in June between this missile exchange we had between Iran and Israel. Israel has shown that it has severe weaknesses. The whole air defense system that was claimed to be able to protect Israel and all that has totally failed. That they have to acknowledge that the Iranian technology is able to bypass the most sophisticated anti-missile defense, and therefore they need more time to rebuild this defense and to rebuild a defense system which has been severed both on the in Gaza, but also and that's for the ground forces, if you want, and the air defense forces with the conflict with Iran. And now they have to rebuild that. The government has also, and that goes back to the previous question you had on the challenges that we have today in Israel. The Israelis have to regain the trust of the population, because what these conflicts have exposed to some extent is the inherent weakness of Israel. And inherent weakness in different uh, aspects. Obviously, you have the military aspect, because the military objectives of Israel in Gaza have not been achieved. And and the attempt to achieve those objectives was at an incredible political cost. I mean, they don't care about the number of Palestinians killed. And that was also demonstrated through different surveys in Israel itself. The Israeli population doesn't care about the Palestinians, period. But they care about the image they have abroad, because at the end of the day, they depend on external support. They depend on US support. Just remind you, recently, this map that was that was published in the US among the Federation of the teachers, Teachers Federation. I think the largest federation of teachers have published a map of Israel where you don't have Israel anymore. It's called Palestine, period, and you have no borders of Israel. And that's an indication, one of the many signs that the image, the perception of Israel, which was quite high in the US for many reasons, has now declined to a very dangerous low. And in the West, generally speaking, um, people tend to despise profoundly not only Israel, but also the Jews at large. And you can measure that with the number of anti-Semitic acts that have skyrocketed in the world. When you see a restaurant in Spain, Italy, or things that refuse Israeli tourists, for instance. So the whole perception of Israel has totally changed. And now the Israelis understand that killing Palestinians is probably nice for them, but it has a price. And the price is the perception of Israel worldwide. I'm not even mentioning all the recognition, all the measures, sanctions that have been applied unilaterally by different countries, and some companies have stopped operating in Israel because it's a bad image. You're just that's become a marketing problem. And therefore, now Israel has to restore that internally. So Israel has a military problem, I explained before, but there's also a societal problem. It has also to restore the trust between the government and the population. It has also to restore the image of Israel. It has to restore these diplomatic ties that have been severed in the world. So Israel comes out of this conflict extremely isolated. But there is no sign that it has abandoned its previous objectives against Iran, against Palestine, about a political solution of Palestine and all that. So what will happen most probably is that Israel will take advantage of this agreement to make a pause in what it's doing, try to rebuild itself, but on the first occasion, everything will resume. Because again, there is absolutely no indication whatsoever that Israel has changed its mind about Palestine, about having a state that covers the whole of Palestine. I mean, the former Palestine. And that includes somehow the extension of the colonization of the West Bank. That will eventually somehow include the recolonization of Gaza. And we have, because nobody talks about it, but you have the colonization of East Jerusalem that is ongoing. So I think Israel has not abandoned any of these objectives, but it just wants to have a better image worldwide. And that's the concern. I think the Palestinians are fully aware of that. The problem is the West doesn't understand that, because we always gave a blank check to Israel. And the reason why we give this blank check is that we consider, and a lot of people, if you go in France, for instance, they consider the Palestinians are all terrorists. Therefore, with terrorists, everything is allowed. Yeah, you see? And the history of Israel is not explained very well. In most cases, when you read history books and things like this, and if you listen to historians, even, especially on the French TV or things like, they will tell you that in 1947, UN gave territory to Israel. And that's totally wrong. Read the resolution. There is not a single, Israel has not gained a single square meter legally. not a single square meter legally. That's the reality. And therefore, the legitimacy of Israel is an issue, definitely. And it's because under pressure, the Palestinians had to recognize. That's why they are so keen to have this recognition in Israel, because they have stolen every single square meter. That's why recognition is so important. And they request, prior to any discussion, they want Israel to be recognized, because legally, if you look at it legally, there is no recognition possible. So you want a political recognition, since the legal one is not possible. And that's very important. By the way, coming back to the question of the borderless state, the UN has asked several times to Israel to define its borders, to define them legally, and Israel has always refused. I mean, they never gave an answer. And so Israel de facto is an inexistent state. That's the paradox.
Well, this is the dilemma as well, though, isn't it? If you're of a borderless Israel, it also makes it very difficult to establish a new status quo. But this will also be in Israel's interest, because once you see now the big shifts in power and, well, the reduced power of the United States, as well as its new focuses in the world, it's a really new interest to have cemented a new status quo. But when you're an enemy to to establishing a new status quo yourself, you do have a bit of a problem. Um, anyways, yeah, Colonel, as always, thank you so much for your insights. It's always, great to pick your brains.
No problem. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.